Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast. We cover everything Major League, from spring training to the World Series. We've got your favorite club covered, from New York to Boston to LA. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Ridenauer, and I've got another wonderful show planned out. We finally have the season here and underway. It's a great feeling knowing that we will have full season baseball this year, and that things are starting on time this year as opposed to last year, which, when they started in the middle of July, I believe it was, a very, very different start date to what we're normally used to. But I hope everyone is doing well. I've got actually my family in town, which has been super nice to have them here. I haven't been able to see them much lately, so having them in town for about a week has been a very, very nice little break from the daily grind, but nonetheless, we've got a lot to go over this episode. I just want to get into some things and discuss, the season and kind of the outlook that we have for this season and the year, so I'll get right into it, and I'll first jump right into any news going around the league. I'll do a recap of the first few days of the season in my next episode, so I'll touch on the major news headlines right now, and like I mentioned, I'll get into the nooks and crannies of the early games of the season in the following week's episode. But later on, I'll get into a little mixing and matching segment, as I'll get into reforming the AL and NL divisions and play some hypothetical situations as to what some divisions could look like if certain teams were switched over into those divisions. I'll then get into predicting which offseason moves will pay off the most early on for some teams, and then as always, be sure to stick around for the final segment today, where I'll get into a buy it or deny it segment, sharing whether I buy or deny the idea that Fernando Tatis will have a better season than Juan Soto this year. So a lot of things going on, a jam-packed episode, and I'm really excited to share with you all. And I want to kick it off with a little comeback story, if you will, or at least a potential comeback story, as the former number one overall draft pick, Mark Appel, is attempting a comeback with the Phillies. Mark Appel, I believe. Mark Appel. But Appel's got a very interesting story. He was a standout pitcher at Stanford. He was the Sporting News Pitcher of the Year in 2012 as a senior. He gets drafted number one overall by the Astros in 2013. And this might be a name that people remember, especially if you're an Astros fan, because there was a lot of talk about who they were going to pick in that draft, and they wound up going with Appel and so on and so forth. And it didn't really pan out the way I think a lot of people had expected it to. It didn't pan out the way that he had expected it to. He actually, in the following season in 2014, 2015, early on in 2014 really, he was starting to experience some elbow issues early on. And mind you, he never had any problems in college. When he pitched at Stanford, everything was hunky-dory. There was no problems. And he was, again, a very talented pitcher, a highly sought-after prospect. And the Astros at the time were using a very interesting pitching system, which is called piggyback pitching system. And essentially what it is starters would have a normal routine start, but then during their off days, they could potentially come out of the bullpen and pitch in relief. And so that extra strenuous and that extra straining on his arm over time, it greatly affected him. And in the article I was reading, he even discussed, and he didn't necessarily blame it on that kind of pitching style or that pitching system, if you will. He more so kind of said, yeah, I was not used to that. I was coming from college, and I was used to just having to start once every 5 days or whatever, and I was not used to having to start one day and then maybe come out of relief 3 days after the fact. And again, coming out of a start where you're throwing 120, 125 pitches, that's probably a lot. That's probably a lot of stress on your arm, and that's what those 4 days offer for, to rest up, to get ready, to go back out on that fifth day. And that's not exactly what he was doing with the Astros. It was not as much rest as he probably would have liked. And actually, the Astros executives at the time, or at least now they say this, but they said at the time, if they had known a little bit more about Appel, they probably would not have drafted him number one overall. And mind you, this was in 2013. So they didn't necessarily have spin rate. They didn't have all these other statistics that they are starting to now kind of gauge and really, I would say, evaluate pitchers with. It's a very, very different evaluation system today than it was 7 or 8 years ago. And so nowadays, and today, they say, yeah, if we had known back then all the things that we know now about pitchers, probably would not have taken him first overall. But then another thing that really kind of sent him downward spiraling, if you will, he had an appendectomy before 2014, and this is the big catch. The doctors had told him that he was not going to need any rehab. They said that the injury or the surgery would eventually heal itself naturally, and so as a result, he did not rehab it properly. What happened was he lost the ability to activate those lower abdomen muscles, and so when he was pitching, he wasn't using that lower part of his abdomen at all. And again, he didn't rehab after that surgery because he was advised against it by the doctors, and as a result, there were a long stretch of period of time that he was pitching without using any lower half of his stomach, really. And again, a lot of pitching is kind of that rotational movement up top. It's a lot of using your legs, using your thighs to push off of the rubber, but then it is also a lot of torque and a lot of rotation from your upper body, and a lot of it comes from your core strength. And he really didn't have any lower core, so that was a big problem. He winds up getting traded to the Phillies in 2015, continued to have elbow issues. He wound up getting surgery for some bone spurs. He also dealt with a lot of mental health problems because all of that pressure, all of that intensity of being that number one overall pick, it started to weigh on him a little bit. And he even cites that the pressure and the expectations to perform to that standard of a number one overall draft pick weighed on him heavily. And I could only imagine what that would be like. You have all of these expectations. These people are expecting quite a bit from you. Again, a number one overall draft pick in any sort of sport, you have a lot of eyes on you. You have a lot of attention, and you're expected to perform at a very, very high level. And unfortunately, that is not what happened. He slowly kind of started to get out of baseball. I believe he actually wound up exiting baseball completely when he was with the Phillies around 2017 or so. He got into some other business ventures. He kind of just, reading the article, it sounded like he just enjoyed being a fan of baseball again. But he said that when he would go to games and he would see his friends that are still in the majors and he would go to the games and interact with them, he started to kind of think about the game as a player again. He started, and he would process the game during, when he was watching in the stands as a fan, he would process the game as if he was a player still and always saying to himself, I wonder what I would do in this situation. I wonder what I would do here. And as a result, he slowly but surely wanted to come back, and now he's announced a comeback. He actually announced it the other day, and the Phillies have supported him. I mean, the entire way through. The new GM for the Phillies is actually a Stanford graduate, so he was very, very supportive of having Apel come back. And it seems to be, he seems to be in a better place than he probably was earlier in his 20s, being that number one draft pick, and things kind of falling apart very quickly from what it sounded like. But hopefully he can work his way back into maybe even an MLB roster and a rotation and, slowly but surely become, a major league pitcher. That would be a great, great comeback story. But we definitely have one potentially on our hands with Mark Apel. But there's also been this concept that's been floating around or at least this idea, I would say, has started to kind of come around in baseball recently. And it's this potential of having 2 seasons in 1 year. But what I mean by this is this. It comes from a story, again, I read in The Athletic, a great read written by the great Peter Gammons, and it's a very interesting concept. Basically, what the concept is and what it means is because of the lack of service time that a lot of these younger pitchers have and the lack of experience down in the minors because there was no minor league season last year, a lot of these younger pitchers have not really pitched in high-level competitive games in almost 2 years. Then you also have to look at the starters from last year, the major league guys. They're coming off a season where it was only a 60-game season. So instead of starting 30-some-odd games in a year, you're only starting 10 or 11. And now you're getting reinserted back into playing 162 games this season. That's a big turnaround. That's a huge turnaround from going from 60 games to 162 in a matter of months. And so what they're thinking is, and what Peter Gammons was saying in this article, is that there might be some teams that use certain pitchers for certain parts of the season. So they might use younger pitchers that have enough service time under their belt to play at the major league level to try and save those other experienced, talented pitchers for down the road later on in the season, so these other pitchers are not wearing themselves out and potentially coming up with injuries as we get further and further into the year. And there is a fear that I mentioned that these younger pitchers that might have to pitch for the first part of the season or whatever it might be, they haven't had enough time in the majors themselves. And so that could be detrimental to their development. And it's just a concept. I'm not really sure if it's going to actually play out, but you can kind of see where the idea of 2 seasons in one is coming from. You have basically 2 seasons within that one season where, okay, we're going to use these pitchers for the first part, and then we're going to use these pitchers for the second part. Some teams are going to do it, some teams are not going to do it, but the big issue that also comes up with this is the issue of service time for some players. Some minor leaguers might be called up sooner than they should be, and others might be sent back down, and it could affect their service time in the long run and their opportunity to be free agents. And we've already seen some of that early on, right? Jared Kelenic for the Mariners, Bobby Witt Jr. for the Royals. Both of them have been playing great in spring training, and Witt somehow gets sent back down into the minors. And Kelenic is worried the same thing's going to happen to him. And so that is another kind of issue in itself with this, is that some guys might be taken out of the lineup and away from their service time at a certain point to, yes, give those other pitchers the time and the opportunity to pitch later in the year. But it could also save some teams from having to deal with free agency discussions and all sorts of other bargaining incentives, if you will, down the road. And so it could set some players back for their service time in order to allow them to make the proper money they deserve. So it's going to be intriguing to see what teams do this year. I mean, I think it's going to go in a lot of different directions, and I think we're going to just have to see how guys' bodies respond to the first couple weeks, and that again, kind of hitting the ground running, if you will, with everything that's going on and just with everything in terms of in the pandemic, but also the long layover that we've had and the players have had, and not to mention coming off a year where you're playing 100 fewer games than you're used to. It's definitely going to be a little bit of a shock effect. There's going to be some sort of shock effect going on there. But I want to now move out of that. I know we've gone through a couple stories pretty quickly, but I want to now move into another one. It involves the Mets. Once again, they've emerged in the news, but there's actually a little bit of, I don't want to say positivity, but there's definitely some great advancements in the right direction for this team, for this franchise. Their new owner, Steve Cohen, who we all know because, again, he came on after the Wilpons gave up their ownership. And Cohen, he purchased a majority stake in the team in the offseason. He recently hired a law firm to investigate the work culture within the Mets organization. And so right now the law firm is investigating the team's handling of sexual harassment issues within the organization and also discrimination problems as well. So Cohen's honestly doing, I think, the right thing, and I think he's a fresh of breath air for the Mets. For about 18, 20 years, they were kind of that team that there was a couple of years where they were really good, but for the most part, they were not very good. And as a result, you can kind of see that towards the end of the Wilpon regime and all of a sudden into, Cohen's ownership time and ownership tenure, there was a lot of issues kind of weeding out the personnel that was under Wilpon earlier on. And Cohen's clearly trying to weed that out. He's clearly trying to change the culture, change the perception, and change things internally in the work environment. And quite frankly, that's a great thing. I mean, this is a team that's had its fair shares of issues over the offseason, right? I mean, this comes in reference to Jared Porter and the entire situation he had, Mickey Callaway and the incidents that they had. And then also, secretly, the club fired a minor league coach, Ryan Ellis, after women had come forward saying he sexually harassed them in 2018. I believe it was 3 women that came forward about it. So right there's, again, lots of issues, lots of things that are going on, and Cohen is trying to nip that in the bud. And I think that is exactly what he's trying to do, and I think it's a great thing for them as an organization. It's great. It's a great thing for him as an owner to set that precedent and set that kind of the bar, if you will, setting the standard and saying, hey, this is not allowed, this is not acceptable, and I'm going to weed out the problem, and I'm going to correct it in whatever way I see fit. And I like that. I think that owners should do that. They should take issues, and try and correct them. Again, you're the owner. You are the master of the operation. You are in charge of it all. And so as a result, you want to have people enjoying where they work, and that's going to bring out the best of their work. Then you want to have the best kind of working environment. And a lot of a lot of these claims, a lot of these issues came under Jeff Wilpon's ownership of the team, and Cohen has made it very clear that he wants none of this behavior. It is completely unacceptable, and he will not be tolerating it under his ownership. And so I give a lot of credit for Cohen and to Cohen for trying to change the environment with the Mets and internally. And I think as a result, that's going to transpire into how the team is viewed publicly and on the outside and externally. I think that's going to be a big difference from what we're used to kind of viewing them as. Again, a team that probably is not the greatest, ran organization, a team that's had really highs and then, really high highs and then really low lows. So I think Cohen is, again, a step in the right direction, and it's definitely going to be a nice new chapter for the Mets. But folks, I want to wrap up this first segment with some discussion on the universal DH and how it could have actually benefited the game more than people assume, and how it could be implemented sooner rather than later, because as we know, that whole issue with the universal DH was all off-season long. That's all you ever heard about. Is a universal DH going to happen? And it also had a lot of kind of effects, if you will, on the free agency, how teams were going to approach free agency, because some players had played so well as just strictly DHs last year, and then now teams are kind of having to reevaluate their rosters. They're going to need a new hitter, but that's not going to happen this year. And it was rejected due to the league trying to use the universal DH almost as a trade piece in exchange for an extended postseason. And the MLB Players Association and the union, they felt that that was not acceptable, that they should be two totally different subjects and two totally different conversations, if you will, and there should not be this kind of back and forth trading or this bargaining with one incentive over the other. And so that's really why they nixed it, is because they said, hey, these are two different situations. And so they did kind of do it to, I think, make the MLB a little bit mad, and they did exactly that. And many in the league, I think they want to have the universal DH kind of changed. They want to have that, implemented. They want to have that as part of a new roster spot. There are some NL teams that want it to stay the way that it is right now, and a lot of people have asked, well, is it going to maybe come into fruition at some point during the year, this, that, and the other? There's no way they can change that immediately or like right now, because a lot of these teams have their rosters set a certain way, and they would have to backtrack and change their rosters completely. It just wouldn't work. It would not work. And the issue surrounding the universal DH was also involving the payment of the players that played that position, because it's not seen as a legitimate everyday skilled position. And so as a result, the payment was going to be a little bit different. And when the payment incentives for DHs were kind of taken out of the agreement, that's when a lot of people kind of became a little detracted from the idea. And the other thing that actually is kind of the bright side of this is that there is the collective bargaining agreement that's coming up in December. It's going to be expiring in December at December 1. And so as a result, there's going to be a lot of discussion in the off-season winter meetings about what to do with the universal DH. And I think that's where we might see a potential return to the universal DH in the 2022 season, because they'll have this conversation, they'll sit down, they'll talk about it. And I think that there is going to be a wide-ranging level of support for this in the long run, because of the fact that they need something to kind of use as, again, they're trying to make the game a little bit more action-packed, and having an extra hitter in the lineup is going to do just that. But the other issue of the lack of the universal DH that people on the side that are for it and are supportive of it is that it jeopardizes the health of pitchers. And it's very true, right? I mean, you see it all the time. And I've, as a lifelong baseball fan, a lifelong baseball follower, I see it all the time. Batter goes in, ninth hole, he's the very bottom of the lineup. You automatically know it's going to be an out. The guy would be lucky, and you're more shocked if the guy gets on base than if he gets out. You're expecting him to get out. But pitchers, they hit a little dribbler to the second baseman. They're not really running. They just kind of trot. They don't even really make it down to first base half the time because they don't want to get injured. And that makes sense. And we've seen it in spring training already. Zach Gallen, who I think, and I've mentioned it before, he could be an incredible pitcher, a potential Cy Young candidate down the road, and really I think the ace for the Diamondbacks. He's going to be out for a while. He had a stress fracture happen on his forearm while he was hitting. And again, that could be a potential threat for some of these pitchers. It could threaten their health, and as a result, there could be some teams that are really, really upset about that, because they are literally putting their pitcher out there in kind of the line of fire and in the potential of getting injured. And if you don't do anything to minimize that, then you're going to have yourself an issue defensively, because now your pitcher's going to be out and injured. And so I think that the universal DH needs to go into effect sooner rather than later. And it's not just a matter of the game and benefiting the game and speeding the game up and whatever else it might be. It's the health and the safety of pitchers because, again, if this is happening already in spring training and we haven't even started the actual regular season, imagine what's going to happen come July 1st. And you see it all the time. A fastball gets away from a pitcher, it runs up on a guy's hands, and he gets hit on his hand or gets hit on his finger. That pitcher's out for 6 weeks, 8 weeks with a broken hand or a broken finger. And again, then you kind of go back and say, well, how could we have avoided this? How could this have been avoided? Well, it couldn't be avoided because you have no choice but to use the pitcher, especially if you're in the NL. And so I think ultimately there will be a very, very big discussion about that in this offseason. And I think that we're going to have kind of this thing where we see the universal DH in 2020, we go back to the normal way or the traditional way in 2021, and then we revert back to universal DH in 2022, and then maybe moving forward. I really hope that, just out of the safety of pitchers and also just to make the game a little bit more exciting. I'm not saying you have to juice the balls and you have to try and emphasize hitting home runs, but I think having that extra hitter, it does shake things up a little bit, and it makes baseball a little bit more interesting, I would say. But that's also going to be very interesting to see how free agency, if the universal DH goes into effect next year, how the NL teams will then approach their free agency next year and their offseason, and who they go out and pick up and who they maybe trade for, who they try to move over to a DH position. There's a lot of teams that could actually really benefit from having a DH. You look at the Mets, for example, you put Dominic Smith over at first base, then you take Pete Alonso over into a DH spot. It's not too bad. That would not be too bad at all. Same thing with the Nationals, right? I think that's maybe their thinking is, okay, if we get Kyle Schwarber now before the universal DH goes into effect, we sign him, we re-sign him again after the offseason because I believe he's only on for a one-year deal. Then we can maybe try and keep him around to be that DH for us, and we won't have to worry about going out in free agency and looking for somebody. So there's a lot of things at play in this, but I hope that one day we do have a universal DH. But folks, that is going to do it for us in this first segment. But don't go anywhere, because when I get back from the commercial break, I'll dive into a reforming of the MLB divisions in the NL and the AL, and what some divisions might look like if they were rearranged. Folks, stay right there. We'll be right back here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast.
This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA, to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
Welcome back to the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Jack Ridenour with you all, and in our first segment, I got in the latest news and some of the other interesting tidbits from around the MLB, but make sure you stick around for the final few minutes of the show today, as I'll get into a buy it or deny it and discuss whether I buy or deny the idea that Fernando Tatis Jr. will have a better season than Juan Soto. So make sure you stick around for that one. But getting into this segment, I want to dive into what the divisions in baseball would look like if some of the teams were switched around in the league, and there was a little mixing and matching. So let's get into how these hypothetical divisions would look like and how the talent on those teams would stack up against each other in the division as well. So going into it, I want to first kind of play out this, and again, these are all hypothetical situations, right? I mean, none of these are actually going to happen. None of these are going to come to fruition. These are just kind of fun what-ifs. If some of these teams were to be in certain divisions, what kind of rivalries would form, what kind of outcomes there would be, who would still be really good and who wouldn't be, so on and so forth. So the first one I want to get into, the Nationals going into the AL East. This would be an interesting one for me. I know last year on opening day the Nationals opened up with the Yankees, and the Yankees won in that game. But I would love to see a Nationals-Yankees back and forth throughout the entire season. Same thing with even a Nationals-Blue Jays back and forth, with how good the Blue Jays have gotten and how much better they've improved their roster over the offseason. Same thing with the Nationals, right? I mean, they're not too far behind, I would say, the Blue Jays in terms of what they did to improve their roster over the offseason. Obviously, I think the Blue Jays have a lot more talent across the board in terms of youth talent, but I will say there's a lot more heavy hitters on the Nationals than there are with the Blue Jays. It's more spread out for the Blue Jays, but it's more centralized for the Nationals, if that makes sense. But I would also love to see kind of this young star-studded battle between Rafael Devers and Juan Soto. They would easily be the two kind of big-time highlighting players that are young and under the age of 22, 23 in that division. And it would be great to see the Red Sox and the Nationals, Devers versus Soto. That would be a fun matchup. Not to mention you'd also have the Orioles and the Nationals in the same division. That would play out into be obviously a little rivalry, the little battle of I-95. That's the major highway that connects between Baltimore and D.C. They already have that kind of Battle of the Beltway series as it is, so it would just be a much more consistent and much more frequent back and forth and kind of matchup that these two teams would have. So I would love to see one day the Nationals in the AL East. I know that is probably not going to happen, but at the same time, I think it would be very intriguing to see nonetheless. So then another kind of hypothetical what-if mix matching, if you will, the White Sox going to the NL Central. I think they would be super competitive in this division, and I know they're already going to be competitive in their division, but I think they can be super competitive in the NL Central, if not even win the division, right? I mean, this is going to be, or this could be a really fun kind of back and forth with their crosstown rivals in the Chicago Cubs. White Sox and Cardinals battles would be really fun to watch. I think that, again, the White Sox across the board, if they were to be in this division, they would have probably the most talent across the board, minus the Cubs. I think the Cubs have a ton of talent. They just are underperformers, and they don't always perform at the level that they should. And I think that the White Sox, on the other hand, have guys that perform when they need to. But again, the Brewers would even make a fun, interesting matchup. I know last year they kind of went back and forth in a couple series. Again, like I said, the Cardinals, that would be very interesting to see. But the White Sox pitching would stand out so significantly. And it would be incredible to see that pitching go up against hitters like Paul Goldschmidt or Nolan Arenado for the Cardinals, or guys like Christian Yelich for the Brewers, or even somebody on the Reds like Nick Castellanos or Mike Moustakas, right? I mean, that would be a fun pitching-batter duel to witness. And not to mention, you would have some serious MVP candidates in this division with Yelich, Arenado, Abreu. They would be legitimate possible MVP contenders each and every single season if they were to be in that division. So the White Sox in the NL Central would definitely make things a little bit interesting, I think. And it would definitely shake things up a bit, right? I mean, I think you would ultimately and automatically have to have a little bit of competition between not just the Cardinals, Cubs, and Brewers, but now the White Sox, right? It would kind of push the Reds and the Pirates down further into the bottom, but I think that there would be a good four-way kind of battle between four legitimate teams. And like I mentioned, the crosstown rivalry with the White Sox and Cubs, I mean, imagine if they were in the same division, right? I mean, you don't really have that in many divisions in baseball, minus the Red Sox and the Yankees. They're the only ones that I would say are the major kind of rivalry that are within the same division. So I would love to see the White Sox in the NL Central even more than I would love to see the Nationals in the AL East, but nonetheless, probably not going to have that happen. But then also getting into another team going into the NL East now is the Blue Jays. Again, this is a team that would, I think, compete well. I think that they would definitely get burnt out by the end of the year because I feel that although the Blue Jays, like I mentioned, do have a lot of talent, I still think that there is a much more talent in the NL East across the board with a lot of players and a lot of teams, but also they have a lot of experienced talent that know how to play throughout a whole entire season. Think about it. The Blue Jays have a very young roster, and they're all coming off of a 60-game season. So you can only imagine what that's going to do to just their rhythm, how they, their feel for the game and everything else, and not to mention being able to go an entire 162-game length and being able to withstand that grueling everyday grind that you have to go through. And so I think that the Blue Jays would maybe struggle a little bit in the NL East just because that is such a talented division, but it would be a lot of fun to watch them go against the Mets, go up against teams like the Nationals or the Braves. And I think that, again, a young team, they could really battle it out, and there would be some interesting battles with, say, the Braves and the Blue Jays. I mean, that would be a very interesting battle. I think the Braves definitely have the one-up on them with the pitching, but the hitting, for the most part, it's pretty balanced for both teams. I think the Braves, maybe you give them a little bit of an added edge just because now they've got Ozuna and they've got Freddie Freeman, but the Blue Jays did everything they could to get guys, and I think that the Blue Jays, and this might sound a little weird, but I think the Blue Jays across the board have much more talented young players than the Braves do. I think really you look at Albies and you look at Acuna Jr., and maybe even Max Fried, But after that, you don't really have a whole lot of major talented young players. Ian Anderson, sure, but you look at the Blue Jays, you've got Bo Bichette, you've got Kevin Biggio, you've got Vlad Jr., you've got guys like Lourdes Gurriel, who's under the age of 30, same thing with Teoscar Hernandez. So you've got a lot of young players on that team that could do a lot of interesting things. And not to mention, we forget about Marcus Semien on the Blue Jays, too. He adds an interesting dynamic. And so I think they could really be competitive in the NL East, but at the end of the day, I think that they would run into a wall at some point. And these other teams, they're just, I think, built for the duration of this season. I think that they're teams that are able to withstand this 162-game grind because they've got talented guys in reserve roles that can step up. I don't really think that the Blue Jays have that, right? I don't think they've got guys that'll come off the bench and make a major impact. And so I do see them kind of struggling in some regards. But it would also be fun to see the rematch of the 1993 World Series with the Blue Jays and the Phillies, so that would definitely be a very intriguing battle nonetheless. But I want to get into this next team because I think that, quite frankly, it would really shake things up in the NL West, but I still think that it would be hard for this team to compete with the top two teams. The Astros going to the NL West. This would be very interesting if this were to play out. I mean, lots of Dodgers and Astros showdowns, and I'd personally love that, right? I mean, everybody has witnessed kind of the back and forth that these two teams have had since the World Series, since the entire cheating scandal came out, the Joe Kelly kind of, face, the pouting face that he made, everything else, all of that. There's kind of this deep-seated, I think, rivalry, or at least this unspoken rivalry, if you will, between those two teams because of all of the matchups they've had in the World Series. And not to mention, I think that the Astros, they would still have a hard time with the Dodgers right now because they're just a different team than what they used to be. But it would be interesting to see them go up against the Padres, who I do continue to think that they would struggle against. But they would be very interesting to go up against the Giants. I think that that's where the competition would really heighten for the Giants, is if the Astros stepped in, because in all honesty, yeah, the Astros on paper are more talented, but the Giants are more of a winning team. They know how to build winning ball clubs. And as a result, I would see the Giants and the Astros making a little bit of an interesting kind of back and forth, if you will. Possibly, I don't know, maybe some rivalries here and there. Again, the Astros on paper look more talented, but I think the Giants could pull together a couple winning seasons. Now, speaking of the Giants, I would love to see if they did a little flop and they went over into the AL West, because I think that this would add a whole lot of competition atop the leaderboard for the Athletics and for the Astros. I think the Giants could give both teams a run for their money. And again, the Giants, for the most part, are an average team, but they could definitely stand out against teams like the Angels, like the Rangers, like the Mariners, that are right now not where they should be. I mean, maybe the Angels are the exception to that, because I do think that the Angels could be a really, really good team. They need to put it together. And again, I'm going to get into it in this third segment here in a little bit about who I think could really be a player that's going to do really, really well early on for the Angels. But I think that ultimately the Giants being in that AL West, it would make things a little bit more interesting for the battle for the first place. And it would also make things interesting for the wild card too, because let's face it, right now, because there's no competition from the bottom part of the division, if the Astros were to be first, the Athletics would be automatically second, and they would at least be fighting for a wild card spot. It's not like in some other divisions where if you're second, you could maybe not even be clinging to a wild card spot. And so I do think that the Giants would make things very interesting. They would shake things up a little bit. And so I would love to see them in the AL West. I think that would be a very interesting thing. Not to mention, the A's and Giants, they've had many battles for themselves. They've gone back and forth in previous World Series. Not to mention, you'd also have the Giants and the Angels World Series rematch of 2002. So you see these kind of little rivalries that could pop up and start to bud, if you will. But again, this is probably not going to ever happen unless some other team were to come into the MLB and they would have to move some team around. But I don't think that the MLB is really worried about expanding right now, because they definitely have bigger fish to fry. But now I want to get into another team that's actually within the NL, and this would never happen. But the Nationals in the NL West, that would be very interesting. It's very unconventional, but I would love the battles between the Nats and the Padres, the Nats and the Dodgers. You'd have some really, really good pitching and hitting going up against some other good pitching and hitting. And honestly, I think that the Nationals pitching could hang with the Dodgers hitting and the Padres hitting. I mean, if you have a healthy Scherzer, you have a healthy Strasburg, you've got Patrick Corbin there as well, and not to mention John Lester signs over the offseason. So you've got guys that can pitch, and that could definitely go up against a team like the Dodgers or the Padres that have a ton of hitting across the entire board. And I do think the Nationals match up pretty well with these teams. And again, they would probably dominate the Giants. They would dominate the Diamondbacks. They would definitely dominate the Rockies. But their pitching would hold their own. I think the hitting would definitely probably come second for the Nationals in that situation, just because they don't have nearly the amount of talent that the Dodgers and Padres have. Again, the Dodgers and the Padres have a ton of super talented players, and they have a multitude of them. Whereas the Nationals, they've got a couple really, really, really talented players that could go up against a couple guys on the Dodgers, but then after a while it just drops off. There's no real drop-off for the Dodgers. Same thing with the Padres. There's no real drop-off for them. And so I would personally love to see a Nationals NL West kind of battle, if you will. Again, it probably won't ever happen, but it's fun to wish and kind of think about what it would look like if they were to go clear across the country and they would go into the NL West. And then finally, I want to discuss the Dodgers in the AL East. Yankees-Dodgers would be such a fun matchup to watch, not to mention, the Dodgers being a team that was once out east before they became the LA Dodgers when they were in Brooklyn. It would probably reignite some old rivalries. I know a lot of the players and personnel were probably not, around anymore from those days back when the Dodgers and the Yankees were in the same city. But now it would be very interesting to see them do that. And the Dodgers pitching would be tough against the Yankees hitting. It would be really hard. And I don't think the Yankees pitching could go up against the Dodgers hitting very well. So it would be an interesting concept to see. It would be kind of fascinating to watch how the Dodgers would go up against and not to mention, you've got the Red Sox there, so that's a little rivalry and rematch from the World Series. So that would be even more fun to watch. But I would definitely love to see the Dodgers in the AL East. Out of all of these teams, though, I would definitely say the Giants in the AL West make the most sense. It would be the most competitive, and it would be probably the most exciting to watch because you would have now a third team get inserted into that division that could really shake some things up between the Athletics and the Astros. And the Athletics and Astros might not feel so safe knowing that, again, there's going to be a third team there. But the likelihood of any of these teams switching around or any of that happening, very, very slim, right? I mean, the last time we saw that was when the Astros flipped over from the NL Central over to the AL West, and we haven't really seen that since. We have not seen anything like that since, and I don't think anything like that will happen anytime soon unless, again, some team is expanded into the MLB and they have to move guys around. They have to move teams around in other divisions to make it even, but I don't see that happening. So it's fun to wish, though. It's fun to think, and it's kind of exciting to see these hypothetical situations. And not to mention, I'm a big rivalry guy, so it's always fun to see what kind of rivalries could form if there were to have some teams that would go into other unconventional divisions, and what kind of matchups and kind of showdowns would start to come to the surface and really to the forefront for people to watch. It would be a lot of fun. But, folks, that's going to close things out here for us in our second segment on the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Thanks again for tuning in, as always. Coming up after the commercial, I'll get into which off-season picks will pay off early on in this season and could really help a team make a big run towards the playoffs this year. It's been a lot of fun so far, but we got a lot more to go, so don't change that channel. We'll be right back here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be, visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Great to have you all here still with me today. Jack Ridenauer again. And in the previous segment, I jumped into discussing what some divisions would look like if certain teams were switched around and moved into other divisions. But I want to now get into which off-season moves could really pay off early on for some teams in this season and could have enormous implications for teams later on in the season making a playoff run and whatever else it might be, because there were some players that, quite frankly, I think, I don't want to say that they were undervalued, but the moves were not really looked at in the same regard as I think they should have been. And there's some players that have been playing really well down in spring training and were playing well in spring training and have been off to really great starts early on. And so I think that we should definitely look at these moves a little bit more as we get into the first month or so into the season, because they could actually be the difference for a couple teams. And the first one I want to discuss is Jock Peterson going to the Cubs in the offseason. I personally, when that first happened, I was not very impressed. I was like, that's whatever. It's literally just a replacement for Kyle Schwarber. It's an outfielder that's an average fielder that's got a powerful bat and he hits a lot of home runs. That's about it. So I was, again, not very impressed with it, but he's clearly proven a lot of people wrong. I mean, he was off to a great start in spring training, was batting over 500 at one point, had 5 homers and 9 RBIs, had well over a 1,200 OPS. I mean, that's what he does. He brings a lot of power into the lineup. I know last year he did not have that great of a year, only had about 7 home runs. But the year before that, he had 37 home runs. And then the year before that, he had 37 home runs in 36 home runs in 2019. And then he had 25 home runs in 2018. So he's coming off back-to-back years of 25-plus homers and then also an 800-plus OPS. So right there, that tells you his capabilities and what he's able to do. Not to mention, the Cubs were 17th as a team in home runs last year. They only had 3 players with double-digit homers. Anthony Rizzo with 11, Kyle Schwarber, who's no longer with the team, he had 11, and then Ian Happ had 12. And then outside of that, you had no power at all. So I think Peterson being in Chicago does a lot of things for them. I think that's going to definitely pose an issue for opposing teams. Not to mention, it's another power bat you have to worry about. And in some regards, I think he is better than Kyle Schwarber. So in some cases, he is kind of an upgrade for the Cubs. Now, again, the Cubs have a lot to prove. They've got this really talented team. They're going back and forth in this contract negotiating with Anthony Rizzo. They've got Baez, who's going to be a free agent at the end of the year. So they have a huge make-or-break season. I've mentioned it before. They've got a big make-or-break season ahead of them. And I think that if they can use Jock Peterson appropriately, he's only there for a 1-year deal also. So this could be a last-ditch effort by the Cubs to try and make as big of a playoff run as you possibly can before you have to let everybody go and go back to stage 1 and rebuild the entire team. But again, this is a big move for them. It's a move I would watch very intently, especially with this NL Central and how up for grabs it is. Everybody's saying the Cardinals are going to run away with it. I don't really know about that. I mean, there's some teams that, again, they've got much more talent across the board. The Cardinals, it kind of drops off after Arenado and Goldschmidt. Yeah, they've got some pretty solid pieces. I mean, Tyler O'Neill was hitting well in spring training. I'll give him that. And, their pitching's been pretty solid. I mean, Adam Wainwright was actually pitching great at one point or another in spring training. So I think Peterson could be that added edge for the Cubs. I don't want to say that he's going to be an MVP. I don't know if he's going to necessarily be an all-star. But he can get you 25 homers and 80 RBIs if he really wants to. And I think that's exactly what the Cubs need. They don't really have anybody in that lineup. I mean, yeah, they probably do. I mean, with Rizzo, they probably do. With Baez, they probably do. Wilson Contreras, not so much. Ian Happ, maybe, maybe not. But I definitely think that Peterson's capable of that, and you can almost guarantee you're going to get some sort of power production out of him. So I really like Peterson on the Cubs. But then getting into another player, and I briefly kind of previewed it in the last segment, is about the Angels, and it's Jose Iglesias over at short now. Comes in, replaces Andrelton Simmons, who left in free agency. And Iglesias is an interesting case because he had a really good year last year, but he played in a little over half the games. He didn't even play in a full season. He batted .373 with a .956 OPS, but he only played 39 games. Now, it's better if he had played 39 games as opposed to 19 games and had those numbers, because I think that would have been a little bit tougher to gauge. But 39 games in a 60-game season, okay, I can see where they were thinking there. Probably not going to put those numbers up this year, right? Let's face it, I don't think he's that capable of a hitter in that regard to be up that high in an average. but I do think that he can be a consistent, solid batter that can be a secret weapon in their lineup, not to mention he brings a ton of defense for them. And he's a little bit better of a defender than Andrelton Simmons is. And I definitely think that, in looking at last year and kind of comparing Simmons to Iglesias, Simmons only played in 30 games, okay? He played in 9 fewer games than Iglesias did. And he actually had a worse batting average, and his numbers were clearly not the same. He batted .297 in 30 games, so it's still a good average, but it's not a .373 average in 39 games. Not to mention, like I said, Simmons and Iglesias were pretty similar in fielding last year, but Simmons had a couple more errors than Iglesias. He only had 4 errors, but Iglesias only had 1 error all of last year. So I think that's another thing. They're going to be getting an improvement at the plate. They're going to be getting an improvement over at shortstop. And I think that could really do a lot of things for this Angels team. And like I mentioned, this Angels team, I think, is looking for any sort of answer in what they can do to try and bring themselves a playoff run. Now, I don't want to say that Jose Iglesias is going to be that main piece and he's the main reason why. That's not necessarily the case, right? That's not necessarily, that isn't what's going to take them to the promised land. It's going to more so be a culmination of the moves they've made in the past, right? You go out the year before and you got Anthony Rendon. So now you've got a pretty solid left side of the infield to work with, and then you hope that Joe Adell's going to turn into the player that everybody's expecting him to. Shohei Ohtani's been playing well. You obviously have Mike Trout, and it's going to be an interesting season for the Angels because, again, it's at what point will Trout become frustrated and say, I want out of here. I've been here for 10-plus years, and we have made it to the playoffs maybe one time, if that, right? And so as a result, the clock is ticking, right? The clock is ticking. And looking at Iglesias, overall career numbers, he's a career .278 hitter, so he's not that bad of a hitter. He did have a career high in OPS, obviously, last year at .956, and a career high in OPS plus at .160. But if you look at, his numbers from previous years, they're pretty consistent. 2015 being an all-star that year, batted .300 for the Tigers. You go down to 2016, he batted .255, and then came back in 2017 and did the same thing in 2017, batted .255. But then from 2018 to 2020, his numbers steadily improved. 2018 he batted .269, 2019 he batted .288, and then last year he batted .373. Not to mention, it's a guy that's going to play a lot, right? I mean, he's played over 130 games in 2 of the last 4 years, right? And I know the 2020 you have to include it, but let's face it, it was not necessarily a full season. But if you look at from 2019 to 2016, he played 130 games or more in 3 of those 4 years. So he's a guy that's going to get a lot of reps over at short, and he's going to be a big-time, I think, presence in that lineup. Again, he's not going to be somebody that takes him to the promised land. He's not going to be the difference maker, but he might be that extra added piece for them that could ultimately get them into a playoff spot this year. And I think this is the year that they finally get over the hump and they finally make the playoffs. So watch Jose Iglesias over at short. Not to mention he had a great play in spring training. I mean, he literally threw a guy out from his butt, and he was on the infield grass or in the infield dirt, had to slide over, literally threw it from when he was on the ground and threw it over to first. So you're going to get somebody that's good defensively, and I would definitely pay attention to how he performs early on, and not to mention how he carries it throughout the rest of the year. We've seen him do it for a 39-game stretch. Can he do it for a 162-game stretch? He's clearly proven he can do it in previous years. He's not going to really bring any power with him. I mean, he's only had 1 year where he had double-digit homers, and it was only 11 in 2019. So he's going to be somebody to watch out for the Angels and see how they are able to perform with him now in the lineup. So another player I want to get into that I think could really be a massive, massive difference maker for this team, Josh Bell on the Nationals. Major power bat. And I think that's what they've been missing, right? They've been missing a guy that can go into the lineup, that can be a scary force, that players can be like, oh man, I do not want to mess with this guy. I mean, he really means business. And he's got a big, powerful bat, and that's what Josh Bell is. I know Josh Bell's coming off a tough year last year. I understand that. And I know that he is only really proven himself one time in 2019. But in 2019, he had an insane year, 116 RBIs. He led all of the NL in that category, 37 home runs. Huge power bat, right? And last year, if you look at this Nationals team from a year ago, they really struggled outside of Turner and Soto. You had Yan Gomes batting the next best in their starting lineup at a 284 clip. But then after that, you've got a lot of guys that are floating around 220, 250 that aren't really producing at the level that people would expect them to. Look at a guy like Eric Thames from last year. First baseman, big power bat that you would think. Only played in 41 games. He had 3 homers. He slugged only 317. 317. That is not good for a guy that is a big power bat, not to mention he has 617 OPS. So right there, that's kind of an example of what they were lacking, and it was power. And that's what the position Josh Bell will be playing. So you insert Bell's numbers over Thames, and it's going to be a big, big difference. And Turner had a great year last year. Soto had a great year last year. And the Nationals, I think, want to protect those two. They want to make sure, okay, there are other players that teams have to worry about. It's not going to just be these two, and we're going to get figured out very quickly, and these two players are going to get figured out even quicker, right? You want to be able to balance out that lineup, and that's exactly what they've done. They've done a great job of that. You throw in Kyle Schwarber in the mix, too, and that's just kind of a little bit of icing on the cake, if you will. And if he can bounce back from the year that he had last year, if Josh Bell can do that, I think this Nationals team can really be a scary, scary ball club. I mean, they had the 4th best batting average as a team last year, and they were one of the worst teams in baseball, if not the worst. They were 26 and 34. They were 4th place in the NL East. They had one of the worst records in baseball, and that just screams they weren't able to convert runs when they had guys in scoring position. And you get a guy that's got over 100 RBIs in a season already logged under his belt, and you look at the rest of this lineup right now for the Nationals. Howie Kendrick from last year retired. Adam Eaton left in free agency. And these kind of go down even further. Carter Kieboom, he hasn't really impressed anyone quite yet. Yan Gomes, he was a free agent, and he is no longer with the team. Eric Thames, the same thing. So I'm curious to see kind of what's going to happen with the Nationals, because I think they need to have a big bounce back year, and I think having Josh Bell is going to do exactly that for them. So I am very, very intent on watching how Josh Bell plays, not to mention played great in spring training. So he's a player that I would definitely pay very close attention to early on in this season, and how he kind of adjusts to a new division. And not to mention, it's going to be a tough division for him to be in, but he's been able to prove it to himself that he can play at a high level. Now I want to get into Blake Snell for the Padres. I think that, and this is going to sound really, really quirky, but I think Snell will emerge as the better pickup between him and Darvish this year. I'm not saying Darvish is going to have a bad year. I think Darvish is going to have a great year. I think he's going to be sensational. But I think that Snell can put up really good numbers this year, and I know that they're going to be going up against much better hitting. But let's face it, right? Darvish is coming from a division that last year probably was one of the worst hitting divisions across the board in the NL Central. So he didn't have necessarily the most amount of competition. You look at a guy like Blake Snell, and he's used to going up against teams like the Yankees over and over and over again. So he's used to these really heavy, deep lineups that teams like the Dodgers also have. So he's a little bit more, I think, tuned into what that's like to go up against. And not to mention Snell and Darvish, both of them, it will allow the pitching responsibility to be divvied up amongst those two, and then also Dinelson Lamet. And Lamet, I think last year, he really had the weight of the world on his shoulders with being kind of the ace of this team. And now you've got 2 other guys that come in. You've got a guy like Joe Musgrove, who can be a really nice back-end rotation starter, a guy that's a 4th starter or maybe even a 5th starter. And quite frankly, if that's your 5th starter, you've got a really good team, because Joe Musgrove is he's nobody to kind of just bat an eye at. I mean, he's a good pitcher. I think he was just in a really bad situation with the Pirates, and I think that him being in San Diego is going to kind of change things and rejuvenate things for his career. But Snell is also not that far removed from his All-Star season, his Cy Young winning season. He's in a great spot in his career. He's young. Last year, record-wise, he was okay, but he had the 2nd best ERA in a season for his career at a 3.2 clip, and he improved it from a year before that was a 4.2 in 2019. So, again, he's capitalized on building after that kind of sluggish follow-up year after his Cy Young performance. He does have a tendency to get into some injury problems, and he's also a pitcher that doesn't necessarily pitch for a ton of innings. So that could be another thing to look at. Could the Padres have to know that, all right, if Snell's on the mound, we'll get 5 really strong innings out of him, but then we've got to go to the bullpen. So he might be kind of a case where the coaches and the manager need to be paying attention to, when Snell's in, because they might have to go to their bullpen earlier when he's on the mound. So it'll be very interesting to see what Snell does, but I'm going to be very, very locked into what they're going to be doing early on in the season, especially against the Dodgers. Watch Blake Snell go up against the Dodgers and compare it to when Darvish has to go up against them and Lamet goes up against them. Me personally, I think Snell is going to do the best job against teams like the Dodgers out of those three because, again, he has been conditioned and he has gotten accustomed to pitching against teams that have really deep, heavy-hitting lineups, like the Yankees from a division that he's coming from. So pay attention to Blake Snell for the Padres. But then now getting into the Astros, Jake Odorizzi, I think, is a guy to watch because, let's face it, they needed him. I'm shocked he stayed on the market this long. I know he's coming off a year where he was injured for the most part, but he's a good pitcher. He's a year removed from his blown All-Star season in 2019, where he had 15 wins and a 3.5 ERA. So a really good season that was not that long ago. And not to mention, this pitching rotation for the Astros is all sorts of banged up. Justin Verlander, I don't know if he's going to come back to the same form that he was when he was, with the Astros earlier in his career with the Tigers, whatever else. He's coming off Tommy John surgery. He's 38 years old. He hasn't really pitched in baseball for consecutive games, or at least consistently, since 2019. The older you get, the harder it is to recover from things like that, especially as a surgery like Tommy John. It's the same thing like if it was an ACL tear. It's very hard to come back from that. And so I do question whether or not he's going to be to his normal self. Then you also look at Framber Valdez. He's out for potentially the entire year with a broken hand, a broken finger, and that now you're kind of down two guys on your rotation. And sure, Lance McCullers can do all he can, and sure, Zach Greinke can do all he can. But I think Jake Odorizzi is going to be the one to pay attention to, because when I think the going gets tough, they're going to look to Odorizzi in an effort to try and pull them out of any sort of situation, because who knows with what's going to happen with Verlander, and who knows what's going to happen with Framber Valdez. So I do think that this would be an interesting player to watch for this team because, again, they're probably trying to make any sort of playoff run that they can, and they're trying to squeeze out the last bit of this team that they've got, this power team that they built, before it's all over, really. So he's a player to definitely keep an eye out for in the early parts of the season and how he kind of adjusts to being in the AL West. I think it'll be a little bit easier for him since he's coming from the AL Central, a little bit more talent over there, I would say, across the board. But I'm very curious to see how Odorizzi does with his new team. And then finally, Joakim Soria for the Diamondbacks. I know that this is a very, very kind of distant, odd thought, and especially for a guy that's 36 years old, but in all honesty, he's coming off his best year since 2015. He had a 2.8 ERA and 24 Ks in 22 and a third innings in 2020. So he's coming off a pretty good year. And again, he's getting older, but he's still performing well. And I think this is a huge upgrade from Archie Bradley. Archie Bradley was not a very good closer for the Diamondbacks at all. Okay, he was not good. I think Joakim Soria is going to be a better anchor in that bullpen for them, and it's a huge upgrade. Not to mention, this Diamondbacks team as a pitching whole got rocked last year. They had a .253 average against them, which was the 9th highest average against in the majors. And again, probably comes from the starting pitching, which now you're kind of down one guy, your ace, in Zach Gallen. But it also came from the bullpen. I mean, you look at their bullpen across the board, it was nothing spectacular. And I think that now they've got Soria there. He comes from a team that was tied for 5th in the league with saves as a team last year. So, again, a good team that comes from a good bullpen. And I think that's going to definitely be the separating factor for them. And so, ultimately, I love Soria for the Diamondbacks. Don't think he's going to do crazy wonders and get them to the playoffs, but I definitely think he can be a very, very good piece for them down the road. So I'm very impressed with all these players, but I'm going to be paying close attention to them early on in the season, and I think everybody else should because they are very interesting new pieces for their new teams. So that'll do it for this segment, folks. As always, thanks for sticking around here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Stay right there, though, because we'll be right back after this commercial break for the final segment today, where I'll get into another buy or deny it as I'll discuss whether I buy or deny the idea that Fernando Tatis will have a better season this year than Juan Soto. So don't go anywhere, everyone, because we've got one last segment here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast.
Want to know the latest in soccer? Then listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Soccer Podcast. From MLS, the World Cup, and the Premier League, we've got you covered. The latest updates, the hottest matches, and news on the league's top players. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Soccer Podcast.
David Beckham scores the goal to take England
Listen now.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the final segment here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Jack Ridenauer still with you, and in the previous segment, I jumped into discussing which off-season ads will have the quickest and earliest impact this season for their new teams, and I want to close today's show with a little buy it or deny it segment, discussing whether I buy or deny the idea that Fernando Tatis Jr. will have a better year this year than Juan Soto will. It's, I think, a question that's going to come up for the next 10 years. Because quite frankly, these two players are going to be the future of the MLB. Fernando Tatis signing a 14-year extension for $340 million tells me a lot of things, and one of those is that the Padres are completely sold on him, and he's already starting to show signs of becoming a really, really good player. Juan Soto has already proven himself, I think, a little bit more, actually, than Fernando Tatis. Again, Juan Soto has shown he can play at biggest stage possible in the World Series and play well at that, right? I mean, that's something to really pay attention to. And I know that Tatis has not necessarily had those experiences like Soto has. They're two very comparable players, right? I mean, Tatis is 22, Soto is 22. They're both pretty young. I would, Soto is a little bit older than Tatis, but they're both young and they're both under the age of 25, and they've both been able to, really, I would say, burst onto the scene as young players. Now, going into some of their career numbers, if you will, and looking at their seasons from last year, but also just in general, you look at Juan Soto. Juan Soto has yet to have a season where he batted below 280. He's played in over 300 games in his major league career. He's got a 295 average, a 972 OPS, a 153 OPS plus in his career. Again, he is 22 years old. He has put up this kind of numbers, okay? 2018 in his rookie year. Played 116 games, batted 292, had 22 homers, 70 RBIs. He comes back in 2019 playing in 150 games, and again, durability is a big thing, especially for these young players to show early on. He had 34 homers then, 110 RBIs, batted 282, and had a 949 OPS, had a better OPS in 2019 than he did in 2018. And then last year in 2020, he was on an absolute tear, 13 homers, 37 RBIs. He had a 351 batting average, a 490 on-base percentage, a 695 slugging percentage, and a over 1,000 OPS. He had an 1185 OPS and a 218 OPS plus. Not to mention, the 351 batting average led the NL, the 490 OBP, the 695 slugging, and the 1.185 OPS, and not to mention the 218 OPS plus, all led the major leagues last year. Quite frankly, if the Nationals had been any good and had actually played well, he probably would have won the MVP. I would have picked him over Freddie Freeman all day, every day. Now, we go over to Fernando Tatis and we look at some of his career numbers. Now, his career has been, again, much shorter. He's only played in 143 games total. He has not played in an entire season. He hasn't even played in over 100 games yet. He's played in 2 seasons, played in 84 games in 2019 and 59 in 2020. In both years, he batted great, right? I mean, 2019, he batted 317. In 2020, he batted 277. But the one thing that kind of concerned me in 2020 for Tatis was his average started off so high. And I remember at one point, I mean, he burst on the scene. He had 10 homers through the first 30-some-odd games or whatever it was, or the first month and a half of the year. And everybody was blown away with his power, and rightfully so. I mean, he literally has, some of the most home runs for a player through 100 or in under 150 games. He's got the most homers in under 150 career games for a player in their first 150 games. So that shows you where and what kind of pace that he's already setting early on. Now, the other thing, though, to pay attention to is that Tatis has not played in a full season. He hasn't played in over 100 games. And so I do wonder, is he able to withstand an entire season grind? Is he able to go through that, and is he able to put up the same kind of production, the same kind of numbers, game after game in a 162-game season? Juan Soto has shown that. Juan Soto has shown that he can play in lots of different situations. You look at the World Series from a couple years ago, right? Juan Soto played very, very well. He was a player that I think, in all honesty, he was one of the main reasons why they were that good and they wound up winning. He batted .333 in that World Series, okay? So he was 9 for 27, He had 3 homers and 7 RBIs in 7 games. That tells you a lot right there. Not to mention, in those playoffs, he batted .277. He didn't bat great in the NLCS, but he batted .277. He had 5 homers, 14 RBIs throughout the entire playoffs. And I know that you can't really say anything about that for Fernando Tatis because he's been on a team that has not really come into their own as well as the Nationals have, because, again, the Padres are a little bit more, I would say they're a little bit newer to the rebuild phase than I would say the Nationals have been in the past. And so that is something I do wonder about. Can Tatis go the full length of the season, withstand that everyday grind, and still put up those numbers? And we have seen, again, Soto do that. And you look at also the fielding. I mean, the fielding, in all honesty, I think you have to give that to Tatis. I think Tatis is a very, very good player overall. I think that he's a great player in the field. I think that he's got a lot of skill with the glove. And Soto, he's pretty decent with the glove. I mean, he's not, I wouldn't say great. He's not terrible, but he's not somebody that really impresses me as a great fielder. I do like Tatis more as a fielder, but Soto is just, and not to mention, and this goes for both players, right? The confidence that just radiates off of these two is kind of incredible to watch. You would think that these guys are 28, 29 years old, and they're 22 years old. They're younger than I am, and they're standing in the box against Cy Young caliber pitchers, and they're hitting bombs and with no problem. And I love Tatis's flair. I think that Soto kind of did that first a little bit. Again, Soto's been in the league a little bit longer than Tatis has, and he's got a lot more time under his belt, and he's proven a lot more. And so it does make me wonder, okay, is Tatis able to do what Soto can do in a full-length season? I would like to say yes. I think that he can. But at the same time, let's also look at the divisions that they're in this year. You look, and both are in very good divisions. That's the thing. I would say that Tatis is in a little bit of an easier division across the board, because if you look at their teams, outside of the Padres and the Dodgers, you're not going to get anything scary from the Giants or the Rockies or the Diamondbacks. So it will be easier for Tatis, when he goes up against those teams, to hit well against those teams because they're just not as talented and they don't have the pitching that the Dodgers have. Now, if you look at Soto and who he has to go up against, he's got to go up against teams that, like the Braves, that have 2 really good pitchers, or 3 really good pitchers, in Max Fried and Ian Anderson and Charlie Morton. Then you look at what the Mets have with Jacob deGrom, and if Noah Syndergaard gets back to full health, he also. And then you look at, guys like, for the Phillies, Aaron Nola, Zach Wheeler. There's, I think, much more talented pitching across the board in the NL East than there is in the NL West. So although Soto has shown he can put on a show, this is the most talent I think he has faced in his entire career, pitching-wise, since he's been in the NL East. Now with Soto, or with Tatis, he's, again, been a little bit more conditioned with the pitching he's got to go up against. He's been a little bit more prepared for what he has to see with the Dodgers. But then after that, he doesn't really have to worry about much from the Giants. He doesn't have to worry about anything from the Rockies. The Rockies have nobody on their pitching that is that scary or that formidable of a pitcher. And then you also look at teams like the Giants or like the Diamondbacks. The Diamondbacks, they don't really, and especially with Zach Gallen out, I mean, it's made things a lot easier for Fernando Tatis. So all in all, I'm very curious to kind of see how they're both going to play this year. I would say that they're going to be kind of the front men for the next couple years in the MLB. They're going to be kind of the cornerstones to baseball, and I think that's a great thing. And not to mention, I mean, Soto's won a batting title. He's won a Silver Slugger. Now, Fernando Tatis has also won a batting title, has won a Silver Slugger. But you look at the numbers, and you look very, very intently at what they've been able to do the last couple years in their career. And Soto's WAR has also been pretty solid, right? He's got a 9.8 career WAR. Then you go over to Tatis, and his, WAR is a 6.9. Now, there is a one-season kind of difference between the two, and Tatis's WAR did take a little bit of a setback from 2019 to 2020. Same thing with Soto, but Soto's WAR from 2018 to 2019 saw a big-time jump. So if you look at that aspect also, from their first to second year, Soto had more of an improvement than I would say Tatis had. Now, again, Tatis was probably on track to make a really, insane numbers. I mean, he had 17 homers through the entire season last year. He had 17 homers in 59 games. So you add 100 more games to that, let's say, he'll have probably close to 30, or he'll probably have over 30 home runs if he kept up with that pace. Juan Soto can do the same thing, though. They both can do the same thing. So I would probably have to say that I'm going to deny this claim. I'm going to deny that Fernando Tatis will have a better season than Juan Soto. I think Juan Soto will have a better season than Fernando Tatis will because of just watching their career trends, the fact that Soto is a little bit more conditioned to play in an entire season as opposed to Tatis. I think the one thing that Tatis has going for him over Soto is that he's not going to face the pitching that Soto will. Juan Soto will face really good pitching. But he's also, again, he has been put into high-pressured, high-intense situations. He doesn't seem bothered by it. He doesn't seem to let the moment get to him. He seems very composed. I mean, watching him in the World Series was a sight to see. He's this 21-year-old, I think he actually turned 21 during the playoffs, staring down these Cy Young caliber pitchers and Justin Verlander and Zach Greinke, and he's not batting an eye at them. He's not afraid. He's not timid. He's not nothing. He was very composed. He was very controlled. And as a result, he hit the best he hit in the entire playoffs in the World Series in the moment that it mattered. Now, I would be curious to see if both of these teams go to the playoffs, what Soto and Tatis do in the playoffs, because then I would also say Soto would do way better than Tatis would in the playoffs. I think that this will be a constant theme throughout both of their careers. They will constantly be compared to each other. They're constantly going to have their numbers stacked up against each other because they've come into the league around the same time. Soto's got one more year under his belt. They're both the same age. They both have kind of the same hype surrounding them. And they've also both shown potential and the ability to be really, really, really good players. I mean, really good players. I think Tatis and Soto eventually will both win MVPs down the road. When? I don't know. And I think that we could see kind of this back and forth of who's the best player in baseball, Tatis or Soto. And I think that, again, this year I definitely have Soto having a better season, and I do deny the claim that Tatis will have a better season than Soto. And it'll just be, the one thing I'll just be paying attention to is how Soto handles himself against really good pitching. And not to mention, there's also a better, I would say, improvement rate from the first to second year for Soto as opposed to Tatis. Now we'll see what it's like for the third year for Tatis, because the third year for Soto, that's where he had the best production. That's where he was sweeping all of the category-leading statistics in OPS and on-base percentage. I mean, again, he probably should have won the MVP last year if he was on a team that was any good. Unfortunately, he was on a team that was not very good, and so as a result, it kind of hindered him a little bit. And so I think that if he was on a team this year that's going to be competitive, that's going to fight for playoff positioning, I would definitely, again, would not be shocked because Soto is that good of a player. At the same time, the other one thing I will say that kind of helps Tatis out is that Tatis can kind of hide behind all the other talent that there's on the Padres. Before, Soto was having to really be the main frontman again. He was the main piece. He was the guy that all pitchers were really honing in on. Now there's a little bit more talent, but everybody's got their eyes on Soto. Everybody is out with their antennas, and they've got their biggest radar out and ready for Soto because of what he did last year and the damage that he did, and even though pitchers probably were still trying to figure him out. And the fact that he's been able to still perform like this, and he's had 3 years under his belt, and pitchers have had time to figure out how he hits, is another thing to kind of make note of for Soto. But again, Tatis, I think he's got a little bit of the one-up with going up against the lesser pitching and the not as talented pitching. So ultimately, we'll have to see. I think it's going to be a great, great battle between these two players. And one day, who knows, maybe we'll have a little World Series between the Padres, or an NLCS, I should say, an NLCS between the Padres and the Nationals. And that would be a fun showdown. That would be a really, really fun showdown. But folks, I think that's going to wrap up us for today. As always, like I mentioned, I'm going to deny that claim. I do not think that Tatis will have a better year than Soto. I definitely have Soto having the better year. But as always, I really appreciate you all listening. Thank you for listening to the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. And I would like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice little review. That really helps us. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, we'd really appreciate that. And as always, everybody, thank you so much for tuning in, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.